This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Midway, the Pacific War's most famous battle. The author, Mark Stille. In April 1942, the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy was at the zenith of its power. It had struck a severe blow against the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 before spearheading the Japanese advance through Southeast Asia and rampaging across the South Pacific. Only a few months later, in June 1942, the U.S. Navy managed to inflict a decisive defeat on this mighty force off Midway Atoll, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific theater passed to the U.S. Navy. Mark Stille is the author of numerous Osprey titles focusing on naval history in the Pacific. He recently concluded a nearly 40-year career in the intelligence community, including tours on the faculty of the Naval War College, on the Joint Staff, and on U.S. Navy ships. He received his BA in history from the University of Maryland and holds an MA from the Naval War College. Happy to have Mark Stille join me now here on Speaking of Writers. Mark, welcome to this program.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, the big question here was Midway the decisive battle?
Yeah, that's gone over in the book in a lot of detail. In most accounts of the battle, which are myth-laden, would have you believe that Midway was the decisive battle in the Pacific War, and I think that's a little bit of a stretch, and that's for several reasons. It's just hard to imagine that in the era of war between major industrial powers, that one battle can decide a war. So that's clearly not possible in the Pacific. And if you look at the definition of decisive, it's a battle that determines the outcome of the battle, the outcome of a war. So Midway, from that standpoint, doesn't quite do that. It did blunt Japanese offensive power, obviously, in the Pacific. But of note, even after the Japanese were defeated at Midway, they were still able to rebuild their carrier force. And within the next couple of months, in the Guadalcanal campaign, they fought a couple of carrier battles with the U.S. carrier force. And of note, the only Japanese victory in a carrier battle was achieved in October 1942, and that's obviously after Midway. So it would be incorrect to say that Midway crippled the Japanese Navy and even crippled the Japanese carrier force. There are many more battles that could be described as decisive in a more classic fashion than Midway.
And why this book on Midway for you?
Well, of course, every Pacific War author has to do a Midway book. It's almost obligatory. But I did it because there's still a lot to say about the battle. I mean, I just mentioned that there are a lot of myths that still abound about the battle. Though, to be fair, a lot of recent books have attacked these and have gone a long way to correct these. But there's still a lot of work out there to do with these myths. So the book does look at these myths, and some of the most egregious ones would be that Nimitz fought this battle facing long odds. Nimitz is way too smart to do anything like that. But that's the standard fare in a lot of these books on Midway, and that the battle was decided by superior American doctrine and tactics, and luck was the deciding factor in the battle as well. And those just aren't true. So I tried to attack those, but the whole book is written though from a different viewpoint. It doesn't jump right into the battle and talk about the battle from firsthand accounts. It goes into the background factors that decide a battle. Uh, and I guess that's based on my naval training and war college training, but you have to look at a lot of factors to understand how a battle will be decided. The plans are a big factor, obviously, and that's never more true than at Midway. So the book goes into a lot of detail on both the Japanese plan, which was incredibly bad, and the American plan, which was obviously, as it turned out, very good. But the American plan was good. It was a flexible plan that was well suited for conditions during the battle. But more than that, you got to look at personalities. You got to look at doctrine. You have to look at the ships and the weapons. And once you understand that, you can understand why the battle was fought the way it was and why it turned out the way it did.
And you go in depth in the book about this. Let's talk about some of the personalities. You mentioned Nimitz, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and the other two key admirals here. You said it was long odds. What else was he risking here, Nimitz,
Well,
personally?
well, to be clear though, it wasn't long odds because Nimitz he was a very aggressive guy, and that wasn't really understood in April or May or even June 1942. But he was an extremely aggressive commander, which he showed at Midway. Uh, but he was not one to fight a desperate battle. First of all, he's too smart for that, like we mentioned, and second of all, his boss, Admiral King, wouldn't let him do that. So he did take risks at Midway, but they were calculated risks. Uh, and he had the benefit of some very fine commanders under him to take his carrier task forces to battle. And you talked about Pearl Harbor at the start of the show, and you did say it, I think, correctly. The Pacific Fleet was not crippled at Pearl Harbor. That's totally untrue to say that. But nevertheless, they were still outnumbered by the Japanese in June of 1942. So Nimitz did use all the assets at his command in this battle, and that included all three carriers that were operational at the time. And they were under the command of an experienced carrier commander, and that was Frank Jack Fletcher, who wasn't an aviator, but it was common for the Americans to have surface warfare officers command carrier task forces, and he was in command at Coral Sea, so he had for the period at least a lot of combat experience, and also this is the advent of Admiral Raymond Spruance, because Admiral Halsey, who was the most experienced and most senior U.S. Navy aviator, couldn't take part in the battle. He had a very serious skin condition, so Nimitz asked him who he would recommend to take his force, and he recommended Raymond Spruance, even though he again was a surface warfare officer and was not an aviator, but turned out to be a very good choice. He made some very wise decisions during the battle. He had the reputation as a cool and calculating mind and a good strategist, and those were all shown to be true at Midway.
In terms of carrier warfare, Mark, Midway was what, only the second carrier battle that the U.S.
Just
was?
a second, that is true. And the first one, like we just talked about, took place at Coral Sea only in May, a month before. So there really wasn't any chance for either side to really incorporate the lessons learned from Coral Sea and use those fully at Midway.
Yeah, so not a lot of experience here on the
Not a lot of
U.S. side.
experience, no, on either side. But the Japanese, though, did have a much more experience with employing large carrier formations because the Japanese carrier force had been active since the start of the war, since Pearl Harbor, and they were active throughout the Pacific, and they even ran into the Indian Ocean in April to launch a large-scale raid against the British forces out there. So they were experienced, but as the book goes into, that's the story because they were also very overconfident, and that was shown in their plan.
Talk about Yamamoto and his plan a little bit here. Where did it go so wrong?
Yeah, that is my favorite part of the book, actually, is trying to dissect the Japanese plan. So uh, Yamamoto's plan went wrong in pretty much every way possible. He ignored virtually every principle of war as he did his formulation for this plan. It's really hard to know where to start when you dissect this plan. But just looking at it briefly, though, it was another attempt by Yamamoto to fight a decisive battle. So he had that in mind at Midway. And as we just discussed, it's really hard to fight and achieve a decisive victory in the context of a war between two industrial powers. But his plan was based on a lot of assumptions, and these were bad assumptions because the Japanese as a matter of course, actually, but especially so at Midway, they ignored intelligence. They disdained intelligence, and they didn't let intelligence drive operational planning like it should. It was the other way around. So they didn't let intelligence get in the way of a great plan. So he had this plan was based on virtually no intelligence. And that assumed that he would have strategic and tactical surprise. And both were not true because, as people know about the battle, most certainly the Americans had forewarning of the Japanese plan because they had broken the Japanese codes, so they knew what was coming. Uh, but the plan on the Japanese side was so bad that when you get down to it, at this point in the war, like we mentioned, the Imperial Navy was much larger than the Pacific Fleet. But when it came down to the actual battle, at the point of contact, the Japanese forces were greatly outnumbered by the Americans. So 20 Japanese ships and 248 aircraft were facing 26 ships and 348 American aircraft. So these accounts that talk about this overwhelming Japanese force just don't tell the whole story.
Let's talk about the air. Why were the B-17 bombers, Mark, so ineffective here?
Uh, they were utterly ineffective, like you just mentioned. They dropped a total, I'm trying to get the number, like 250 bombs all told, and not one hit an American ship, hit a Japanese ship during the battle, because their doctrine had them attacking from high altitude, from 10,000 feet and up. And when you're trying to strike a maneuvering target, which can move, quite a distance in the time it takes a bomb to fall from 10,000 or 15,000 feet. It's virtually impossible in this era of unguided bombs to hit anything. So all the damage during the battle was caused by American naval aircraft. The Army Air Force aircraft achieved no hits during the battle whatsoever.
I want to talk about Midway Atoll too. If the Japanese had invaded Midway Atoll, would that have changed anything?
That's a very good question, and that's ignored in almost every account of the battle. And there's been some new information recently on the Japanese plan to actually invade the atoll. So I use that in the book, and I think for the first time ever, somebody's gone into what would have happened if the Japanese tried to uh, take the atoll. And as you mentioned, it's an atoll. There are two islands that make up Midway Atoll. So when you look at the forces the Japanese had and their doctrine for conducting amphibious operations, and you look at the Marine defense and how they're going to fight this battle, there is virtually, and of course, in war, there are no certainties, as Clausewitz told us, but there's virtually no possibility that an invasion of Midway Atoll would have been successful. So, uh, that is, not well known, but the garrison on the atoll was very much prepared for any Japanese invasion, and that actually outnumbered the invasion force coming at them. So it wasn't going to happen for the Japanese. So was it important? It probably it might have resulted in the ironic situation that the Japanese were able to win the battle, perhaps, or at least achieve a draw. And then they were facing the prospects of trying to land on the island, land on the atoll, and that was unsuccessful. So that being the case, they would have had to break off the action in any event, even if they were successful against the American fleet or not.
What was your research process like for this book, Mark?
As you might imagine, Midway being, like the title suggests, the most famous battle of the Pacific War. There's a lot of sources out there. Uh, and but and the hardest part, as always, is trying to find good Japanese sources. But of all the battles in the Pacific War, that's the battle that you can get the most Japanese sources, uh, uh, from. So I was able to get enough of the Japanese official history of the battle to make a useful contribution. There are several diaries from Japanese participants in the battle, which were good. And also another gold mine is the so-called Nimitz Gray Book, which is the running diary of the Pacific Fleet staff during the battle. So, uh, but what the book I think stands out about the book is the level of analysis in it, because no one's going to find a smoking gun here about the battle at this point. That goes into Nagumo's mindset, who's the commander of the Japanese fleet. Exactly what he was thinking on the bridge of Akagi at 10 o'clock in the morning as he was trying to figure out whether to launch an immediate strike or not. We're not going to find those kind of nuggets. So this book, I think the hallmark of the book is the analysis that goes in to the mindset and the doctrine and the tactics and the plans on both sides.
So you said Nimitz was a diary keeper. What about Fletcher and Spruance? Any good nuggets from their diaries?
There's a lot of good stuff about those commanders, and there's a particularly good source by John Lundstrom, who's a well-known scholar of the battle, and it talks about how the staff that Spruance was stuck with, because it was Halsey's staff, and Spruance took over just before the battle, so he was stuck with this staff, supposedly a high-performing staff, but during the battle it melted down. So there's always more to the story here as far as personalities go, if you can dig a little deeper and see why people were doing what they were doing. But it was surprising even to me when I dug deep into that story about how bad Spruance's staff was during the battle.
And what would you like readers to take away from Midway, Mark?
That's another good question. I would like them to take away some insights there, all this mythology. You talked about the notion that the battle was decisive or not. That's covered in the book. It talks about the pre-battle mythology and the balance of forces between the sides. But I think I like them to look at this from a different and detached standpoint. And if you look at all those things we talked about, the leaders and the doctrine and the tactics and the forces and all that stuff, and keep in mind that for any naval battle in particular, that there's always this friction of war and the fog of war present, and both sides were faced with that. But I think, unlike most accounts in the battle, I think once you look at all those things, a Japanese defeat was the most likely outcome of the battle. Uh, and that's not to say that that American victory was inevitable, because there's always the uncertainty of combat. And Americans had a lot of tactical issues at the battle, but I think the big takeaway is that despite the mythology, that a Japanese defeat was the most likely outcome of the battle.
The book is Midway, the Pacific War's most famous battle. The author is Mark Stille. Thank you so much for joining me, Mark.
Thank you, Steve.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast.